The Young and the Restless Spoilers shock. A murder occurred at Kane's party in France, but the killer is still unknown. Chance is secretly investigating, but has no legal jurisdiction. Rumors spread that Chance was killed during his surveillance. Nick is arrested by local authorities, with all evidence pointing to him as the murderer, even though he doesn't understand why. Kane is portrayed as someone with power, allies, and control over the territory. Below is your requested dramatic, immersive narrative in continuous prose, minimal paragraph breaks, and a soap opera tone, in the grand chateau nestled deep in the French countryside, beneath chandeliers that had once seen royalty and in a ballroom that echoed with laughter and the clinking of crystal flutes, darkness found its way in, and took hold. What began as a glamorous soiree hosted by Kane Ashby under the guise of international diplomacy and elite networking had become something far more sinister. The whispers began just after midnight. A scream muffled by music. A body. Blood on silk. Then silence. What followed was a chaos that no champagne could wash away. The guests, once glowing with ambition and curiosity, turned pale with suspicion. One of them had been murdered. And no one knew who had done it. Or so they claimed. The news of a murder at Kane's party spread like wildfire through Genoa City and beyond. The media couldn't resist, the sonorous voice of scandal singing from the wine-stained walls of an ancient French fortress, wrapped in power, mystery, and legacy. But behind the headlines and beneath the surface, something more deliberate was unfolding. Because this was no random act. This was a calculated killing, the kind of move only made when the stakes are impossibly high. And someone, somewhere, wanted it to look like an accident. Or worse, a tragedy without explanation. But this wasn't Genoa. This wasn't Chancellor Park or Crimson Lights. This was foreign territory. This was Dumas's playground. And anyone who entered it without understanding the rules was already halfway to their own funeral. Unbeknownst to most of the guests, at least those who weren't too busy sipping vintage rose or plotting their next seduction. Chance Chancellor had slipped into France quietly, like a shadow with purpose. No credentials, no badge, just instincts and a promise he'd made to himself. He had heard the whispers about Dumas. He knew that Kane had resurfaced under that name, shedding his old skin like a serpent, walking into the world of aristocracy and criminal sophistication with terrifying ease. And Chance, ever the dutiful protector, had decided he couldn't ignore it. He had to know what was happening at that estate. Who was being invited? What deals were being brokered under candlelight? Who was being used, bought, or silenced? So he watched. From a distance. A drone overhead. A camera in a tree. A bug in a cufflink. Quiet eyes in a loud world. But Kane was never a fool. And Dumas, the persona he wore now like a custom-tailored suit, was even more dangerous. For every move Chance made, Kane had already made 10. He had eyes in the halls, allies in the kitchens, and security so discreet you'd forget they were watching until the barrel of a gun kissed your ribs. This wasn't a party. This was a warning. A trap wrapped in velvet. And Chance had walked straight into it, trusting only his gut and forgetting that Kane had no rules left to follow. Rumors started to trickle in, first from a contact at the U.S. Embassy, then from an anonymous video that surfaced on a dark web server. A man matching Chance's description, bleeding out in the woods behind the estate. One shot. Center mass. A blurry figure fleeing. Silence again. The signal was lost. The message encrypted. Then nothing. People began to fear the worst. Had Chance been killed while investigating Kane? Had Dumas claimed his first public casualty? Or was this a decoy? A distraction? Chance had disappeared without a trace, and the world, even those closest to him, didn't know whether to grieve or prepare for his next move. But either way, the game had changed. And then, in a twist no one saw coming, it wasn't Kane or his associates who were detained. It wasn't some international arms dealer or shadowy diplomat. It was Nick Newman. Arrested. Shackled in public. Hauled away from the estate like a common criminal. The French police had come in with urgency, armed with warrants and a confidence that could only come from one thing: overwhelming evidence. Fingerprints. DNA. A weapon traced back to Nick's flight luggage. Surveillance showing him exiting a corridor moments before the victim was found. Blood on his cuff. And the victim? Still unidentified to the press. Still anonymous in official statements. But those who were there, the ones watching from behind champagne flutes and fake smiles, knew what that kind of setup meant. Nick tried to speak. He pleaded with the guards. "I don't even know what's happening," he said. "I didn't kill anyone." But his voice was drowned by flashing cameras, reporters shouting questions he didn't understand, and a growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, he had walked into a narrative that had already been written without him. One where he played the perfect scapegoat. Because Nick wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't part of the original guest list. He had arrived after receiving a mysterious tip. An email from a burner address, warning him that something terrible would happen at the estate. That someone he loved was in danger. That he needed to come. So he did. And now he was the one in danger. Back in Genoa City, Victor was already mobilizing. His son had been arrested. His legacy was at stake. And his enemies, both old and new, were beginning to circle like wolves around a wounded lion. Victoria questioned everything. Sharon began to fear that Nick was being framed for something far bigger. Phyllis smelled the scent of conspiracy and knew exactly where to look: at Kane. Because only someone with unlimited money, power, and international reach could orchestrate something so airtight. And Kane, or Dumas, as he insisted on being called, had every reason to want the Newmans distracted. Humiliated. Vulnerable. The mystery deepened as conflicting reports emerged. Some said the victim was a powerful investor with ties to multiple corporations in Genoa City. Others whispered that it was a woman, someone who had known Kane from his past, someone who had threatened to expose everything. But the truth, like the moonlight over the French hills, remained elusive. What was certain was this: someone had died. Someone had planned it. Someone had ensured that Nick Newman would be the face of guilt. And someone, whether it was Kane, a ghost from Chance's past, or a third player lurking just beyond the velvet curtain, was pulling every string. Now, as Nick sits in a cell he never thought he'd see, and as Kane sips a glass of wine on a balcony overlooking a garden that had been scrubbed clean of blood, the game moves into its next act. Chance, if he's alive, knows more than he ever should have. Nick, if innocent, has become the pawn in a war much larger than him. And Kane, reborn as Dumas, stands at the center of it all, not as a host, but as a king. One who's willing to let his enemies destroy each other while he builds an empire out of their ashes. What comes next is anyone's guess. But one thing is certain: this was never just a party. This was a trap. A spectacle. A sacrifice. And by the time the last candle burns out, everyone who walked through those doors will have to answer one question. Not just who the killer is, but who they became the moment the music stopped. Let me know if you'd like to continue this storyline, for example, Nick's trial, Chance's fate, or the identity of the victim. Absolutely. Based on your new details, I will now expand the dramatic narrative, continuing from the previous text. It will now incorporate these key twists. Kane is confirmed to be Dumas. Kane deliberately framed Nick for murder using a meticulously crafted crime scene. Chance is revealed to have been killed, not out of cruelty, but because he posed a threat to Kane's larger plan. Nick is emotionally shattered, begging Victor and Nikki for help. Kane is calm, calculating, in control. He can make anyone the criminal if he chooses. I will continue the article in the same immersive, long-form English narrative, 10,000 plus characters in total, with rich emotional intensity, continuous prose, and minimal line breaks. It was never about chaos. Cain Ashby, now living under the powerful and enigmatic name Aristotle Dumas, never allowed for chance or coincidence. Every movement, every whisper, every glass poured and every candle lit at his gathering in France had been part of a larger design, one that few could begin to understand, let alone unravel. The death at the estate wasn't random. The arrest of Nick Newman wasn't a mistake. And the disappearance, no, the death, of Chance Chancellor wasn't a tragedy. It was necessity. Cold, clinical necessity, enacted by a man who had grown too tired of being a pawn and had finally become the one moving the pieces. The scene had been perfect. Down to the droplets of blood strategically left behind, the time-stamped footage, the planted weapon, and the carefully manipulated timeline. Cain had constructed a crime so flawless that even Nick himself began to wonder what he had done. That was the brilliance of Dumas. The ability to make truth feel like illusion and illusion feel like truth. When the police arrived, they didn't hesitate. They had every piece they needed. The gun had been cleaned, but just imperfectly enough to leave a single print. Nick's luggage, which had never left his side, had been found with the victim's earring wedged in a hidden seam. And the surveillance? Manipulated. Spliced. Enough to show Nick in a hallway at just the right time. Too perfect to question, too messy to be coincidence. It was the mark of a master, and Cain knew it. Nick never stood a chance. He wept when the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He screamed when they pulled him through the hallway in front of the guests. He begged them to listen. But no one was listening. The French authorities, proud and efficient, did not take kindly to foreign interference. The U.S. Embassy issued a statement of cooperation. And Victor Newman, upon hearing the news, didn't just hear that his son had been arrested, he heard that his empire had been insulted. That his legacy was being toyed with. That someone had dared to paint the Newman name in blood. And Nikki, shattered and numb, held her husband's hand with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from rage. Their boy was in a foreign jail. Their boy was being called a killer. And they didn't even know who had died. But Cain did. And so did those closest to the truth. In the privacy of his estate's high tower, a sanctuary far from the flashbulbs and sirens below, Cain stood before a wall of monitors, each one blinking silently, recording every inch of his domain. On one of them, a still image of Chance Chancellor's lifeless body. A smear of red across his chest. Eyes open, lips parted, as if he had been about to speak when the bullet took his breath away. Cain didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply watched. Chance had been a complication, a good man, but a curious one. He had broken protocol, crossed borders, and entered a world he didn't understand. He had snuck past Cain's guards, entered the secure wing of the estate, and accessed files that were never meant to be opened. And in doing so, he had become a threat. And Cain did not tolerate threats. Not anymore. I didn't want this, Cain whispered to no one. But you left me no choice. The truth was ugly, but clear. Cain had evolved. He was no longer the man haunted by his past, betrayed by love, or dismissed by the titans of Genoa City. He had become something else, a force. A strategist. A builder of legacies through destruction. Dumas was not just a name, it was an idea. A promise. That no matter where you were or how powerful you thought yourself to be, there was always someone smarter, someone watching, someone pulling the strings behind the curtain. And Cain, Dumas, had waited years for this moment. To return not as a son of scandal, but as a godfather of fate. To show the Newmans, the Abbotts, the Chancellors that their world was not unshakable. That their names did not grant them immunity. And what better way to prove that than by making Victor Newman's son a murderer in the eyes of the world? As Nick sat in a cold cell, trembling, replaying every second of the night, he cried. Not because he believed he was guilty, but because he no longer knew how to fight something so precise. He called Victor. He called Nikki. And when they answered, his voice broke. "I didn't do it," he whispered, as if saying it aloud would somehow break the spell. "You have to believe me." But even as he said it, he knew the walls were closing in. The trial would begin. The victim's identity would be revealed. And unless someone could outsmart Kane, truly outsmart him, the conviction would be sealed. And somewhere deep in the estate, behind reinforced glass and locked doors, lay Chance's final message, a voice recording, encrypted and incomplete, captured moments before his death. A whisper of truth that could undo everything if found. But for now, it remained silent. Like the grave that now awaited him. Chance had died because he asked too many questions. Because he saw too clearly. Because he stepped onto a chessboard thinking he was a knight, not realizing he had walked into the hands of the king. And Kane, merciless, brilliant, and without regret, had made his move. The world would mourn Chance. Nick would stand trial. The Newmans would fight. And Kane, as Dumas, would watch it all unfold with the calm of a man who had already won. But in the shadows of Genoa City, something else stirred. Those who still believed in justice, in truth, in loyalty. They hadn't given up. Jill Abbott, haunted by the past she shared with Kane, began asking questions. Phyllis Summers, sensing a deeper conspiracy, started digging into Dumas's European holdings. And Victor, silent but unrelenting, began preparing his own kind of war. Because for all of Kane's brilliance, there was one thing he had not accounted for: revenge. And when it came, it would not be clean. It would not be polite. It would not be legal. It would be personal. Because someone had killed Chance. Someone had framed Nick. And someone had underestimated what a family like the Newmans, broken, bruised, but still breathing, would do when backed into a corner. And in the end, it would not be the question of who died at Kane's party that mattered most. It would be who was willing to live with the cost of survival. Let me know if you want to continue with Victor's retaliation, Nick's trial, or the discovery of Chance's final message.